Okay, today we're going to go through the review for the ancient Greece test and some of the notes that were associated with that section, or the three sections for this particular test. The first thing that students will have is a vocabulary sheet that looks very similar to this. This particular side has the four keywords of peninsula, colony, polis, and democracy, as well as the definitions for each of those, all of which are in sections 1, 2, or 3. We spent a lot of time talking about democracy and it being a form of government where citizens are voting and running the country. And then we also talked a little bit about colony and the kind of the idea of colonization and how the Greeks did that and our connection with the American colonies from the British. On the back of that sheet, we had three things that we really focused on. The Hellenistic era we did not focus a little bit on. That was more of a preview of things to come. But we did talk a lot about the oligarchy, which is a form of government for a small group, as well as the epics and myths that the Greeks were writing at that time. One of our big focuses for this particular unit was in the area of questioning strategies. And we had what was called a QAR strategy, which is question and answer relationships. And these are some of the questions that we used and the students had. In section 1, our big focus was on the Minoans and Mycenaeans. And a couple of the things that they contributed, the Minoans became a very big trading civilization through their shipbuilding and their production of goods that were used for trading. They became, as you see here, the Mycenaeans learned that shipbuilding, but also learned the bronze making and bronze working, which became a big part of their culture and their civilization. And then down here, one of the other kind of ones that I have a point on here is this whole notion of geography and its relationship to the Greek people. And specifically, the mountains and seas really divided the people of Greece, which created a situation where the city-states were fiercely independent and kind of isolated. Another idea that we spend a little bit of time talking about that will be on the assessment is this idea of Greek citizenship. And we talked a lot about the notion of what a citizen is. And for the ancient Greeks, you had to be a male, native born, and you had to own land. And that's what required you or allowed you to be a citizen. And we talked a lot about how that really meant not a lot of people were citizens because there were a lot of outsiders as well as females and a lot of people that were in slavery, therefore not owning land. And then on the back side, one of the things we talked about was this idea of once you are a citizen, what are the rights that you had? And the three, really there were four, but the three big ones are the right to vote being the number one, being able to hold office and defend yourself in court. They also had the right to own property, but really the three of defending yourself in court, holding office, and voting were the three big ones. And we did talk a little bit about city-states as well as some of the other things that happened from an economic standpoint in Greece. Moving on into section 2, we spent a lot of our time talking about the city-states or the polis of Sparta and Athens. And we even did a whole class debate on this and looked at how those two city-states were wildly different in their approach to education and everything. Sorry about the glare, but the daily life for Athens and Sparta was different in that in Sparta, and you can see I kind of swapped these here, but in Sparta it was very military-minded. Boys were put into the military at the age of 7. Girls were trained in competitive sports. Everything was very physical and very militaristically minded. In Athens, on the other hand, it was very much about education and learning. Children went to school. Even the girls in the household were taught in the areas of household and keeping a household, but education and learning were so important to them. And then we look at their forms of government. The Athenians were kind of known for creating a democracy. Very different from our own current democracy in America, but they were given credit for starting first democracy, which was the rule by citizens. And then in Sparta, they had an oligarchy, which is that government where you have the rule by a small group or rule by few. And then we talked a lot about the contributions of these two city-states. The big one for Sparta is that they really were the ones that saved Greece during the Persian Wars. A lot of that relied on their military and their abilities in the arts of war. The Athenians are very well known for starting the Olympics, their contributions in the areas of art, architecture, buildings, and just overall culture, and a lot of connections with what we would consider our Western or modern civilizations. And then the next area that we talked about was in the area of forms of government. And this was the chart that we used in class. And we had the three forms of government: the tyranny, the oligarchy, and the democracy. We used a kind of an example in class of a little role playing we did with kids making a band. And then we have our definitions. The tyranny, where one person is ruling. You have the oligarchy, where you have a small group. And then you have the democracy, where you have all of the citizens. And it's very important to know that it's all of the citizens and not all of the people, because not all people were citizens. And then you can see the advantages and disadvantages of each one. And a lot of it has to do with the swiftness of decision-making, as well as the involvement or level of involvement of the people in that country. The other thing we talked about was then we moved into the era of the Persian Wars. And the kids had a yellow QAR sheet, very much like the first one, where it was looking at the different battles of Marathon, Salamis, and Plataea, as well as Thermopylae, and some of the strategies that the Greeks used in order to win those battles. And the big focus of this section was on 2 or 3 leaders. The first one was the leader by the name of Cyrus the Great, who was a Persian king, and you can see his contributions here. He united the Persians. He, after capturing Babylon, allowed the Jews to return. And then he also built the Royal Road, which was a huge advantage in connecting his empire. And then we moved over to Darius or Darius, and he is credited for reorganizing the government of Persia, and specifically he divided the empire into satrapies, which were essentially that we would think of as states or provinces. And then he also started paying his soldiers a working wage, so he had the first professional army of the ancient age. And then we went a little bit farther with our review in terms of comparing the 3 rulers of Persia and looking at their contributions and comparing them to each other and what they did. And this is one of the reviews that we did in class with the 3 different rulers. The third one that we didn't mention yet was Xerxes. He did far less than the other 2, but he still had played a part in the Persian-Greek battles of the Persian War, and you can kind of see some of their contribution there.